Now let us turn to 1 Samuel chapter 30 as we continue in this chapter. 1 Samuel chapter 30. Last week, I did not finish the message. We asked ourselves the question about, well, now when we do not turn to God, our Lord, our God, for encouragement like David, now what would happen? Look at 1 Samuel chapter 30. Now look at verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, and every man for his sons and for his daughters. But David encouraged himself in the Lord. David encouraged himself in the Lord. And we saw how to do that, what it means to encourage ourselves in the Lord. Because as Christians, we often talk about that. We want to be encouraged. We want to encourage ourselves in the Lord our God. What does it mean? We saw that. We saw how David began by encouraging himself in the Lord in verse 8, by prayer. By prayer in verse 7 and 8. By prayer. We use the alphabets, the letters P-A-R. How can we get on par with David in this spiritual encouragement? The first step David did was pray, and let us learn to do that. To turn to God in prayer. To seek forgiveness, to seek help. And David accepted that his sins have caused all these problems. The A. David acknowledged it was his sin, and he accepted it. He did not, push it away. David accepted the consequences of his sins. David accepted what the Lord has ordained in this situation, his will. And then the R. Look at verse 9. And David went. Now, the encouragement for the Christian is not just to talk about it, feel good that we've talked about it, even feel good that we prayed about it, even feel good that, we accepted things in our life. Now, encouragement in the Lord, when God says David encouraged himself in the Lord his God, it brought action. Verse 9, all right? David responded, made restitution, did something about it. To just keep talking and praying does not bring encouragement. It is when we begin to live what we prayed and asked God for help in, until we begin to just embrace what God has allowed, we remain, all right, not encouraged. So please be very clear about encouragement. Now, the last thing I want to do in way of reminder, which is very pertinent for today's message, is number one, what is spiritual encouragement? I hope that you remember. Every time you kneel before the Lord, Lord, I want to be spiritually encouraged. You seek someone, I want to be spiritually encouraged. This word encouraged here in Hebrew has three parts, three things to it. I hope you remember, because otherwise you encourage yourself wrongly. And the first one, encourage, has the idea of trying to find strength, right? To get strength. To get strength. In fact, I was thinking how to help us remember this. You know, you are lost in a place. You are traveling. You are fearful. You are in trouble. You need a GPS, right? You need a GPS. Then when you have a GPS, you feel encouraged. You feel safe. So the G is to get strength, all right? To get strength. Christian encouragement is not just whining and moaning about things. It is to get strength. A spiritual strength. This is not just talking about things. Get strength. I want strength, Lord. Not I want to just unload. Now, the second part of this Hebrew word. Now, after getting strength, it's not just I want to get strength and talk about it. It's to put forth. All right? To put forth means the P, right? To put forth strength to withstand. You are discouraged about something. You are struggling about something. You are knowing that your sin has caused many consequences like David's life. Your failures, your lack of repentance. Lord, I want to get strength because I want to use this strength. I want to put forth this strength to withstand the sins that I am in, all right? To put forth strength to withstand. Now, and then the S. It is not just for a week after camp, for example, or for a few days after you turn back to God, you seem to be revived spiritually, and then you are striving to overcome sin, striving to draw closer to the Lord, and then after a week it fizzles out. No. Encouragement, this word, has to do with hold strongly, all right? To strongly hold on to what you have known. Hold on with God. In other words, it is to press on, right? To stay, in other words, that is to stay in the Lord's strength, to stay on the path, the straight and narrow path, to stay on it. So do not think of Christian encouragement as anything else than that. So we read verses like that, I want to encourage myself in the Lord. The Christian encouragement means very different things from what the world thinks about encouragement. Now, if I please come for this afternoon's Adelphos Adelphi, we are going to talk more about how the world trains us to think about encouragement, all right? So do come. I will cover a lot more details in there, God willing. Now here, so that is encouragement, all right? To get strength, to put forth that strength, to withstand sin, and to stay strongly on that path by the grace of God, and stay with God on that, all right? Now, so that was what we learned last week. Now we come to this week where, now what if you do not find encouraged, do not ensure that you find encouragement in the Lord your God, like David? What will happen? What will happen? Because sometimes when we are in the consequences of sin, when we are in trials, difficulties of life, now the flesh does not want to go through this GPS, right? What will happen? Now the first thing we will see, what will happen when we do not seek encouragement in the Lord our God? We will get on par with these 600 men, right? So we will use a different PAR. We will be on par with these people. In what sense? Now the first thing you notice, look at verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because of the soul of the people were grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. They lost their sons and daughters. They were captured by the enemies. They lost them. Now, and what did they want to do? They spake of stoning David. The P points is about, they pointed to David. They blamed David for the consequences of their sins. They were saying, David, if you, why did they want to stone David? Why did they not want to stone each other? They saw David as the person who led them into the enemy's territory. But think about this, they followed David willingly. They enjoyed the war booties. They enjoyed staying in the land, they enjoyed the farm, they enjoyed the garments they took, they enjoyed the luxuries, they enjoyed the animals that they had. They could eat, they could use them for farming. They enjoyed themselves. But when something goes wrong, they pointed fingers at others. Now, when you do not turn to God humbly, meekly, in prayer, that is what will happen. I don't want to pray. I don't want to accept my responsibilities. What else would you do? Point the fingers at someone else. They blamed David for the loss of what they had. Now the title today is about encouraging ourselves in each other. You see, this was a case. They were encouraging themselves, but it was in each other's behavior. 600 men wanted to stone David. We can encourage ourselves in each other in a negative way. Please remember that. You do not want to have the right PAR. You have the wrong PAR. And then you will be on par with the 600 men. They stirred each other. They encouraged each other to blame. They encouraged each other to act in a way that was like, we are right, David, you are the problem. They just ganged up. You know, Even the world understands this behavior. It's basically herd mentality, H-E-R-D, herd mentality. Yeah, one animal doing this, the rest of them will tend to follow in a herd, right? Now be careful of not turning to God for encouragement. You will turn to man for negative encouragement. You will follow how others behave. Eventually, well, we will point fingers at situations. Well, let's start with point fingers at people, all right? We will point fingers at people. We will point blame to others. It is our natural tendency. The flesh is like that. When Adam fell, what was the first thing he did? When God looked for him, this woman that you gave me. That is our flesh. Please remember that. That is our natural behavior, our sinful, fallen behavior. Blame. I do not want to pray. I do not want to seek forgiveness. I want to blame. It's a very dangerous behavior. He not only blamed Eve, he blamed God, the woman that you gave me. You see how horrible it is when you don't have the right PAR, when you don't turn to the Lord in encouragement, when you behave in this way. Eve blamed the serpent. The serpent. The serpent deceived me. Now, Christians, let us be very aware. Whenever we are in trials, whenever we are in consequences of, we know our sins, you will have that welling up. I do not want to take accountability. I want to blame. We blame our family situation. We blame our jobs. We blame our bosses. We blame our health. We blame many other things, all right? We blame our school. We blame the government. We often blame the church, right? Because, well, you give tithe and offerings to the church. So the best people to blame, right? Yes, true. Well, churches fail to feed the sheep. And then you fall into various sins, make many wrong choices. The church is to be blamed. The church failed. The sheep failed to feed you. Christ told Peter, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep, all right? Feed my lambs. So, yes, the church can fail you. But do not forget, just like in David's case, David did fail them. But they did not do what was right themselves. They followed. You did not want to bother to read the Bible yourselves. You did not want to seek a place where the Word of God is taught. Then you continue in your waywardness, but you blame the church. And in the case where the church does everything right, and you fall into sin, you blame the church as well, right? It's common. You don't come for Bible studies, you make wrong decisions, or you want to live in sin, and then the church teaches how you should live holy and consecrated life. It's always extreme, and then you say, the church is so difficult, so strict, I do not want to be here anymore. You blame because you do not want to do something about your life. Very often people leave church and they blame. They have become worldly. They love the world. They want to live in sin. They want to live in disobedience. So they will blame. Everyone around can see their lives are holy, are worldly. But blame, someone in church offended me. I do not like certain policies in the church. Blame. Christians, when you blame, when you play the blame game, the only person that will lose out is you. These were the people. They just blamed, right? Why do we like to blame? Why do you like to blame? Why do you think we are like that? Because blaming makes you feel good. Blaming means I am not at fault, right? Blaming means it is not me who have caused these consequences in my life. Blaming is something that absolves ourselves and makes our conscience, all right, dull. It's not me, it's David that all this problem has occurred. They were suffering the consequences of their own sins. Now, I've mentioned last week as well, the understanding of misery loves company. Misery loves company. The world sees this behavior in sinners. And they coin this very appropriate description of sinner's life. Misery loves company. Now the idea is when you are unhappy, you feel better knowing that others are experiencing the same unhappiness, and you will hurt together with them. You look for these people. You love their company because they are in the same boat. These 600 men, they're all in the same boat. Lost sons, lost daughters, lost wives. They're all in the same boat. They hurt together. They love to encourage one another to continue in what would bring them physical relief, right? Stone David. Not my fault, stone David. Then if we stone David, we feel good. So you see, this misery loves company. You look for people who are like that, in the same boat. Why? Because when everyone else want to do the same thing, then it will now look like what you do not want to get right is fine. You can stay in your backsliding. You can stay in your worldliness. You can stay in your disobedience because everybody agrees this is right. The other Christian is wrong. The church is too extreme. We all can live this life, right? You get to continue like these people. They get to continue in their decision to want to do something that pleases their flesh. So you see the danger, dear friends, when we do not turn to God, we will feel justified. We justify wanting, like them, we justify stoning David because it's David's fault. We do not look inward to acknowledge, but we entered into enemy's land. We stayed in the enemy's land. We fought with David in enemy's land. We supported David. We are also accountable. Christians, when you fall, do not blame your parents. Parents, you have a responsibility. Of course, do not blame your children. My children are just difficult. Do not blame singlehood. Do not blame seniorhood, right? Do not blame teenage phase of life. Now then, just remember, someone who keeps complaining, oh, how difficult the Christian life is. Oh, how difficult the consecrated life is. We are just always just blaming. We will blame other things. When you keep moaning and groaning about how difficult it is to live the Christian life, that is so demanding, so exacting. The straight and narrow path is so painful. I have to make so many sacrifices. Now, please understand one thing. You are in spiritual dehydration. We learned that at camp. You are in spiritual dehydration and just blaming and blaming. You are also blaming something. You are blaming the Christian life to be being difficult. You are blaming still something. You are blaming God. God, why must you set such a difficult standard? God, why must you make us keep the Sabbath? God, why must you make the family model like that? God, why must... So you will blame. God, why must marriage be so difficult? So you keep blaming, keep complaining. You can complain against situation. Please remember that. Blame that marriage life is difficult. Blame that singlehood is difficult. Blame that having children are difficult. You just keep blaming. You are actually blaming God. Please remember that. Don't just moan and groan over how difficult the Christian life is. They are groaning, moaning and groaning. Like I said, we'll cover more of that this afternoon, but I'll leave it at this for now, all right? Now then, with that blaming and pointing at others, it leads to anger. Now, after you blame, now you know it's not my fault. Now I can get angry at someone. I can get angry at something because I'm not at fault. When you don't turn to God, that is how you will behave. Now, look at why do we bring in anger? Look at verse 6. Now, David was greatly distressed. Now, because the soul of the people was grieved. Grieved. Now, note this word very carefully. Note this word very carefully. This word grief has to do with an anger that is bitter. So there will be angry bitterness, a bitter anger. How do we know that? Now, this word is, in Hebrew, is marah. I think immediately light goes up in your mind. Marah. The waters of Marah. When the people were in the wilderness, they were angry at Moses because the water was bitter to drink. That is why it's called Marah. Marah is bitter. The water of Marah, the place that was then called Marah, right? Bitter water. They were upset. They were angry. Later on, they were also upset and angry that, following you into the wilderness, now we don't get to eat the garlic and the leek that we used to enjoy, our favorite food in Egypt. They were angry at Moses. They often were angry at Moses, like these people, they wanted to stone Moses. Same behavior. First, it's not our fault, it's your fault, Moses. And then, next, what? Get angry, right? Get angry. Now and please remember, this is a bitterness. When you don't turn to God for spiritual encouragement, and you continue in this blame game, bitterness will grow. Please remember that. You'll become a very bitter Christian. Well, you are going through the consequences of sin. You chose to sin. God warned, sin have consequences. Now, unless you embrace and acknowledge that, I acknowledge and I accept, it's my sin that causes, you become bitter at God. You may say that I'm just bitter at this situation. No, you are bitter at God. Because consequences of sin is set up by God. God says sin has penalty. I don't like the penalty. Who sets up that penalty? The law of God. God himself. Right? Please be very clear, Christians. When you are moaning, groaning, and you're bitter about something in life, you are bitter at God. Do remember God's chastisement. Please remember this. When God allows consequences, it's chastisement. Chastisement, the word chastisement, chase means pure. God is trying to make you pure. God's chastisements are meant to stop you, draw you back. At this point, God will allow very severe consequences. Because all this while, they just won't respond. We are like that. We need to wait to very severe consequences, then we want to respond, right? It's for our good. Do not get bitter at God when we have sinned and God chastises us. It's for our good. Now, moreover, in the case where you have not sinned, but God allows certain trials in your life, do not get bitter. Do not get bitter. Why is my boss like that? I'm living a life to obey God. But as a result, I get ostracized in school, at work. As a result, they pick on me. I chose not to do something that is sinful. I get fired, right? Or whatever. It was not me. And then we begin to get angry at our bosses. Please do not do that. When God allows this thing in your life, that God in his wisdom is teaching you spiritual lessons. All these trials, rejoice in them. God has a spiritual purpose. And if it glorifies him, then let it be so. All right? Don't get bitter. So you see again, when you do not turn to God for encouragement, and you see how people will behave, they complain, they moan, they point fingers, they get bitter at people or situations, you will follow them. You will encourage one another. You get into their company, you encourage each other. But in a negative way. Turn to God for encouragement and for strength, right? To do something. Now then, as we complain about difficulties in life, right? You are truly wanting to live a holy and godly life. But you find it very challenging. And you find that you have to make great sacrifices, in your personal life, in your family life. You have to give up certain things. Turn to God. When you turn to God in prayer, when you acknowledge, Lord, I must be holy. When you acknowledge that holiness reflects God, when you acknowledge holiness is for your spiritual good, so that you don't fall into consequences of sin, you begin to change in your thinking. You do not end up encouraging others to follow your complaining, right? So praying, acknowledging, embracing, accepting God's will for your life. God, why do you will this for my life? I wanted to be this, to be that. If you don't turn to God, you will become bitter. God allows certain health issues in your life. If you don't learn to find encouragement in the Lord your God, you will learn to find encouragement in bitterness. Bitterness is something that the heart loves as well. I just love to feel bitter, all right? It is far better to complain and be bitter and nurse the bitterness than to want to do something spiritual, to draw strength, to deal with the problem, to live and stay in that state that God has willed for your life. If you don't, remember this word here is marah. They had a bitter anger. But it was not against David. Please remember that. Now, how do we know that? Please turn to Exodus, all right? I do want you to look at these verses for yourself. Please turn to Exodus chapter 16. Exodus chapter 16. Now, maybe we look at chapter 15 first. All right, chapter 15. Now, God chose to use this grief, all right, this same word, to describe the situation to us. Chapter 15, verse 22. Now, so Moses brought Israel from the Red Sea, and they went out to the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. And when they came to Marah, right, the same word, Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. So they were bitter is Marah, right? They were bitter. Therefore, the name of it was called Marah. Now then, the people murmured against Moses, blame, point their fingers at Moses, P, all right? And saying, what shall we drink? See, they gang together, we. Now the group think. The herd mentality came. You see it. They now encourage one another to complain. Be very careful of such attitude at work. That is not a good testimony. Worst of all, be very careful of this attitude in church. All right? You build groundswell. This is how problems occur. Now, when the church is wrong, there are ways to deal with it. Not to raise bitter anger against the church. That Christ died for the church. When the church is wrong, do follow the procedures to help. Not to go round. Gather like these people, 600 men. Gather together, let's behave this way. All right? Encourage one another. In secret. To talk. To blame. To complain. To moan. To gripe. To grumble. Right? You encourage each other in a negative way. So that is what shall we drink now? One person say, we, now say everybody, yeah, we, all because of Moses, now we are all in trouble. Then look at verse 16. Now, this is where we must come to a clear realization what this bitter anger is about. Look at chapter 16. Now, look at verses 7 to 8. And in the morning, now this is what Moses told them. They complain about the bitter water. They complain about the food that they missed. They were complaining, moaning, griping, grumbling, pointing their fingers at Moses. Look at verses 7 to 8. And in the morning, then ye shall see the glory of the Lord. For that he heareth your murmurings against the Lord. And what are we that you murmur against us? Verse 8, and Moses said, this shall be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat, and in the morning bread to the full, for that the Lord heareth your murmurings, which you murmur against him. And what are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. Now this brings forth very clearly, Christians, when you don't turn to the Lord for encouragement, and you start to point, you start to blame, you start to absolve yourself, you start to keep saying, well, we want something, but it's because of someone else's fault. When you murmur, you are murmuring, repeatedly made clear here, against God. Who are we? Moses had to try to help them understand. This pointing at me, this bitter anger at me, it is against God. When God has ordained something, when God allowed something, and you just complain about your health, you complain about many things, but due to your choice, sinful choices, complain about your spouse, but you chose to marry that spouse. Complain about your children, but you chose not to bring up your child in the Lord. You complain about many things. You are complaining against God. You're murmuring against God. What are we? Your murmurings are not against us, but against the Lord. Let that be very conscious. Every time we want to open our mouth to moan and groan about things, point fingers, God has allowed the situation. Your sin has allowed the situation. Now then, you have just become mourners and discouragers. That is what it is. You have just become mourners and discouragers. But you encourage each other to act negatively. Right? When you don't turn to God for encouragement, you become a discourager. Discourage people from doing what is the right PAR. Now then it leads to the R. So first, you point. Then after you point, the more you think of it, bitter anger arises. Then the next thing naturally happens, and you will retaliate. You will retaliate. We want to stone David. You will retaliate. Now this word grief. Now I explain the second part of this word. It is not just about a bitter anger, all right? It is laced with rebellion. Laced with rebellion. Laced with provoking to anger. Right? You want to use the R to remember rebellion, that's fine too. But it's retaliation. And here, Moses reminded them, the Moses that they wanted to stone, right? Reminded them. You are murmuring against God. You are retaliating against what God has allowed. Now the first stop of having no water that they can drink. They need water. God understands that. God will provide water for them that can be drunk. But before even anything, instead of turning to God to pray, God, please provide water. They want to point fingers. They want to get angry. Instead of the P, pray. Instead of acknowledging that they need the help of God, they pointed at Moses and they get bitter anger. And now they want to rebel. In the first place, there was no need to behave like that. When God allowed something, turn to God in prayer, not get bitter at God, right? There was no need to behave like that. That was what angered God. I will help, I will provide. Why do you behave like that towards me? Now the rebellion now will be, I do not want God's will for my life. We do not. When they were complaining, no water that we can drink, no food. When they talked about food, they talked about Egypt. Now they want to stay in Egypt. Their will. God, we do not want to go to the promised land. We want to stay there. Now you will rebel against God's will. Why do you take us out here? You should have left us there. The stubbornness of our will. Now we will begin to rebel against what God ordains, what God allows. Be very careful. When you lash out at situations, at people, you are lashing out at God ultimately. And ultimately, well, you are telling God, shaking your fist at God, I do not want to accept this health condition. I do not want to accept this financial situation. I do not want to accept this problem in my life. I do not want to accept it. Before this, I didn't have all these problems. For them, before this, we could eat all those things, right? Now that we obey you, Lord, now that we obey you to go to the promised land, now we have all these problems. That is the behavior. Christian, when God tells you, walk in this way, yes, you will have to bear the cross, your own cross. You have to deny self. It is always to draw you to live a life that will glorify God. And when a life glorifies God, it will always be for your good. Please remember that. Don't retaliate against that, all right? Now Moses said, this will be when the Lord shall give you in the evening flesh to eat. Exodus chapter 16, verse 7. And in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord. For he that heareth your murmurings against the Lord, what are we that you murmur against us? You will see the glory of the Lord. That was a warning, right? That was not just a, well, you will see the power of God to provide you with food. No, you will see the glory of God. You will see how when God appears, when, yes, God will provide, but God will provide it to the point where you will loathe the thing. Don't rebel against God's will. When God shows His glory, means His sovereignty. This is what I will do. And we rebel, there will not be good consequences. Do not wait till God have to show His glory. All right? Humbly submit, humbly embrace. It's always for your good. Why do you want to doubt God? Now, when we refuse to change, we will go down in a vicious cycle in this hour. You will go down in a vicious cycle. Now, this hour has also a reminder. You will remain in misery. Please remember that. You do not want to turn to God for encouragement and understand what encouragement means, right? Please remember the GPS. You do not want to accept that. You will only stay in your misery, in your bitterness, in your moaning and groaning, in your pointing your fingers at others. It's not my fault. I can't live this spiritual life because of this and that. You will just keep staying in this horrible, horrible state. That was what they were. Now, I want you to notice this. Look at 1 Samuel chapter 30. 1 Samuel chapter 30. Let us notice what God says. Look at verse 4. Now, David himself, look at verse 4. And David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep. David was feeling the same pain as them. David, the Bible says, David and the people. David himself also wept until there was no more tears to weep. All right? They were exhausted, drained. But notice that God says in verse 6, yes, David was greatly distressed. Now look at the last part. It says, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. But the difference between David and these 600 men, although David experienced the same emotions of sadness, of pain, of loss, David experienced the same thing as them. The difference between David and these 600 men who encouraged themselves in each other in a negative way was, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. David did not remain in this grief, bitterness, grief, this this misery, because David chose to follow the right PAR, right? David chose not to remain there. You have a choice. Which would you choose? I mentioned this many times. After the fall, that is our behavior. Our behavior loves to blame. When blame, we deflect. We are the one who have sinned. We are the one who have caused the problem. We love that. We feel good about this. And the more we complain with people, we enjoy both people agreeing with us. So we don't have to do anything. But to continue in it is good, right? We feel good, right? But yes, if you want to remain in that misery, then choose that. But God says, look at David. But David encouraged himself in the Lord. David chose to get strength from God, not continue to complain. David chose to do something, to put forth that strength. He prayed, and then the Lord said, yes, I will help you. Now I have strength. He decided to put forth that strength to now go fight the battle. And look at verse 9. And David went and his 600 men that were with him and came to the brook Besor, where those who were left behind stayed. Now in verse 10, there were 200 men that stayed behind. They were too exhausted. 6 days journey, back and forth. When they came back, cried till they are exhausted. 200 men could not make it. Right? But David stayed. The S, the G, the P, the S. David drew that strength and David stayed. We will go. Yes, 400 men. I don't even know how big the army is that we are going to face. But we will go. He stayed with that strength. He stayed with God. He stayed on that path to do something. That is how he got out of this downward spiral. Don't retaliate. Respond in the right way. Don't remain in that misery. Misery loves company. Misery loves complaining. Misery loves the same people who are feeling the same misery to complain together. Otherwise, you choose to spiral downwards. Now then we come to the last thing and we end. Encouraging ourselves in one another. Now, look at verse 9. David went, he and the 600 men. Now this was a bright spark. A totally different scene. All right, a change of scene. A very bright scene now. From very down and despairing scene. Now David went, he and the 600 men. It meant that the 600 men now stopped the wrong PAR. Now they followed David. David said, we will go. And they went, and his 600 men. So God made this to show us. All right? Now, this is the right encouragement. This was the right encouraging one another. Instead of continuing to stir one another, to stone David, the Bible says David and his 600, repeatedly saying 600, 600, 600. Why? Why? To show the unity of heart now. We will stop pointing fingers. We will stop having bitter angerness. Let's do something instead of retaliating. Let's now work together with David. Now this is what we must learn. Don't just sit there and complain and moan and think that this is doing good. It's not doing you good. It's not doing the church good. It's not doing others good. You pull them down. But now the 600 men say, let's do something. Let's follow David. You now encourage each other in a positive way. You stir each other up. Then one after another, let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. 600 men, let's go. All right? Even the 200 were totally exhausted. They tried. Instead of stirring. We are so tired now. We will die in this battle. David, are you now going to not only cause us to lose our sons and our wives, now cause us to lose our lives as well? No, even the 200 men, totally exhausted, said, we will go. But there was a physical limit to them. Encouraging each other in the right way. Now you can choose, right? So you can choose to be a moaner or a doer. You can choose. David chose to be a doer. And then it began to spread. Sitting and complaining and moaning and not talk about now what should we do helps nobody Now the 600 men began to stir each other. Now there's a very funny situation in life. You know, sometimes at work, people moan and groan about the boss, about the company, about policies and all that kind of thing. Then you as a Christian, well, you feel the same pain, you feel the same challenges. And then you begin to say, yeah, and you share with them, yeah, you know, this is really difficult for us and all that. And then you begin to say, you know, let's look at the bright side. Why don't we try and do something? You know, we can do, look at this way, we can do this thing and all that. Well, there's not much choice, right? This thing has happened, so let's make the best of it. How do people treat you? They look at you with anger, right? So now, what? You're the goody two-shoes, is it? So you're saying that we are bad, is it? So now you're on the company side. Now that is our behavior as well. The 600 men here did not do that. They stopped. Complaining and moaning brings no results. But if we are moaners and complainers, we do not like people who even they are in the same boat as us, now to begin to talk about what should we do, what we can do, what should we focus on. Just we acknowledge these failures in our spiritual walk. What should we do? Not leave it hanging. Just to complain and feel good. And we don't like people who now start to talk about what to focus on. David now start to focus on, let's go and fight this battle. When people start to say, let's go and fight this spiritual battle, we are all in the same boat. We feel the same frustration. We feel the same failures. We feel the same inadequacies. But let's go and fight together. They chose to fight with David. 600 of them. Are you one of those who in spiritual conversation, when people bring up all this complaining, and then someone who say, yeah, I struggle with the same thing, but you know, we really remember the message, remember what we read, remember this that we've learned, let's focus on this. You're so hypocritical. They could say, David, you're so hypocritical. You know, because we like to continue in self-pity, right? David, you know, you're so without empathy and whatever it is. Here we are complaining, and then here you are talking about do better. Now, are you such a Christian? You get angry at people when you talk about your failures, and then they say, well, you know, as Christians, we all struggle with this. These are things that we can consider. Why don't we stir one another in this? Talking to people like you is just a waste of time. Instead of sympathizing, talk about all these spiritual things. Right, so we need to be very careful. Don't leave things just hanging. It does nobody any good. In fact, it will stumble. It will pull others down. It will make young Christians feel, oh yeah, Christian life is a miserable thing. Christian walk is so difficult. It's impossible. Now, David heard, look at verse 8. The Lord said to him, pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail. Shalt surely and without fail. David could say, God, you know, you don't understand. We are so tired. God, why are you expecting me to do this? David responded. And when David responded, others responded. David could say, this hopeless situation. Just stone me. You can be a moaner and groaner and love to do that and hate people who you see as, oh, so you're trying to be more godly. So David, now you're trying to be more godly. No, David had faith. When people have faith, we believe that if we struggle, we strive, God promised in His Word, He will help us spiritually. Everything in 2 Peter chapter 1, everything that we need for holiness and godly living, God promised to give us. He promised to be with me. He promised to be with us. Those people who believe in the promises. Now, do not write them up. Do not get angry at them for saying that. They could have gotten angry at David. We are gathering here and talking about all this. Then you want to talk about do what is right. Right? Believe that God will help you. Come on. You know, how are we going to fight an enemy? We don't even know how many people, and we are just all totally drained already. David, come on. We can't be like that. And if you're treated like that, don't be discouraged. All right? GPS. Stay on course with God. others will begin to follow. Fathers, are you discouraged? Mothers, are you discouraged? Singles, are you discouraged? Elderlies, are you discouraged? God promises that when we want to make restitution, David wanted to make restitution, the correct R. God says, now I will help you. From here, you are going to see a different David. Please remember that. When David followed this PAR to be encouraged in the Lord, this is the first time after 1 year and 4 months, David did the right thing. He followed the PAR that we see here. Those steps, David will turn around completely. You will see a very, very different David. Like, a few months back, someone walked up to me after service. I don't like David. I lost all respect for David. I told the person, well, when we examine our own lives, we are like David. We must only see the mercies and the long-suffering of God. We are like David. Don't judge David in that way. Learn from David mistakes, then learn from David. You are struggling with your spiritual life. You find that you're backslide. You find that you feel that you cannot. And then you meet other Christians. We can. Don't feel discouraged. You can choose to be among these 600 men with David. Let's go fight the battle, make restitutions. God will help us. Which would you choose? Don't yield to the temptation of the wrong PAR. Let us rise to sing the closing hymn. Shall we rise? 391. Shall we rise? 391.